The Stamina Sorcerer has been one of the most mobile and also easiest classes to play over the last few years. It's looking incredibly strong both for single target damage but also for AoE as well. This video is going to show you why and how. Hi, this is Liko and welcome to my Stamina Sorcerer PVE Build and Rotation video for the Flames of Ambition DLC. Today we are going to showcase two solid melee builds with the kind contributions of Zorax. Firstly, we will show you a really simple double dual wield build, and in my opinion, I think this is the strongest PvE build in the whole game for how easy it is to use. Following this, a two-hander dual wield build will be shown in order to provide you with some different options. Please do like this video and subscribe to Zorax and myself to help word of this Stamina Sorcerer get around. It really does help us out. By the way, this footage is nearly 2 years old. It's the most recent Stamsorc trial footage that I have, but I found it instantly on Liko.gg. Hopefully it can help you in the future too. Anyway, before diving straight into the builds, I'll first outline the fundamentals including choice of race, Mundus Stone and food. So for the choice of race, Orc used to be the flat out best for stamina DPS, but this is no longer the case. From now I will recommend either Khajiit or Dunmer as your very top choices. It's a toss up between the two, so honestly go with whichever you prefer out of those. However, having said, Orc really isn't too far behind. It still has some other very useful perks, so if you're currently an Orc, this doesn't mean you have to race change. So for the choice of Mundus Stone, in many cases for stamina DPS, I would recommend the Thief Mundus Stone for extra critical chance. If your crit chance is already pretty high before picking a Mundus Stone, like around 65 or 70%, then you could go with the Shadow Mundus Stone instead for extra critical damage. Now I can't put an exact number on it as it will depend on your exact build that you set up with, but if in doubt, I would go with Thief. Choice of food. Now this will most likely depend on your level of sustain and your HP threshold that you're comfortable running with. If you could do with a little more extra sustain and you don't feel like you need the extra HP, then lava, foot, soup and salt rice would be the way to go. If you're practicing on a target dummy, then I would also recommend selecting this food. If your sustain is decent but you need a little help with it and you need some HP as well, then I would recommend the Artaeum takeaway broth, which gives the best mixture of everything useful. If you don't need any help with your sustain, then you can go with max HP, max stamina food such as braised rabbit with spring vegetables. And this should give you the most DPS as long as you don't run out of resources. I should also mention just in case, but there is also a pure max stamina food, which gives a tiny bit more max stamina than all the previous, but nothing else. It also doesn't last as long, so for most people this is not worth it. An example of this is the Hearty Garlic Corn Chowder. Okay, cool, so let's take a look at setup 1. Firstly, let's go through the gear. We are using 5 pieces of Kinra's Wrath. This is a brand new set that you can collect from the Black Crate Villa dungeon. The 5-piece bonus is really cool. When Burning Heart is up, after keeping up light attacks, you gain Major Berserk and grant Minor Berserk to those around you. This is probably the first example of a buff set that also gives an extra benefit to the wearer. Next, we have 5 pieces of Relequen. This has been a bread and butter component for stamina DPS for several years now, nothing's changed there. The Veteran Perfected Daggers, these got released with the new arena back in the autumn of last year. They work really well across a number of different stamina classes, so I would recommend you go farm these if you haven't already. It makes Shrouded Daggers really strong and cheap to use as long as you're standing behind the target. I'm using damage poisons on the front bar with None Honed and Sharpened trait. In a real fight you might consider replacing the Sharpen with a Precise Dagger instead if penetration is good enough. Lastly, we have the Black Rose Perfected Daggers on the back bar. Dealing damage with Blade Cloak gives 6% damage done and reduces damage taken by the same percentage. Infused daggers are best here as we won't be spending a lot of time on the back bar. Poison and Flame enchants are really good, and this is especially true if you have enough blue CP to get the extra magical status effects. The Berserker Glyph can also work really well here too. Alright, let's move on to the skills used for setup 1. So on the front bar, the Veteran Dual Wield bar, we have Bound Armaments. Really great skill, has some really strong passives that increase max stamina and light attack damage, but when activated, for the next 40 seconds you can cast it again to throw knives, similar to the Nightblade Bowproc ability. It's recommended that you recast this every 4 or 5 weaves to get the maximum benefit, no sooner. For this rotation, we can stop using it at around 45 to 50% since the Shrouded Daggers with Veteran Dual Wield becomes more valuable at this point. Next up, the Twilight Tormentor. This skill is double barred, and as long as you have it in attack mode, you don't have to do anything since it'll attack for you. This skill actually scales with magic stats, but even then it's worth using. Yay! Worth mentioning at this point that all sorcerer class abilities give 2% spell and weapon damage when slotted, so that kind of is a nice benefit as well. Next we have Barbed Trap, which gives a pretty decent damage over time and also minor force. Shrouded Daggers is our spammable, which we'll use a lot in this rotation. Below 50%, most of our skill casts will basically be visibility alone. Also worth mentioning that you'll get really good cleave damage with this ability too, since the daggers can bounce off if there are more than one target. Next we have the Clan Fear, which is very similar to the Twilight, except that it does scale with stamina based stats. I think that this is the first DLC where we've seen, or at least I've seen, 2 summonable pets for the Stamina Sorcerer, which is kind of weird but cool at the same time. Again, this skill is double barred, so I won't mention it going forward. Our ultimate here is Flawless Dawnbreaker, generally slotted for the fighter skill passive, which is 3% weapon damage. Our back bar ultimate, the Storm Atronach, will be our main one. However, this Dawnbreaker can be used towards the end of the fight if you know you won't be able to charge up for another Storm Atronach. So moving on to the back bar, the Black Rose Dualwood bar, firstly we have Consuming Trap. This is a magic costing single target dot which does pretty decent damage, and you can drop it at 50% in this rotation. In the description below, I'll also include a CMX pass where Rending Slashes is used here instead. Rending Slashes does do more damage per cast, but costs stamina, which does make a difference towards our sustain. In a real raid situation, if sustain is good enough, you might consider using Rending Slashes here instead. Next we have Deadly Cloak, which provides good mitigation by default, but is super boosted by the Black Rose Dualwood weapons. Make sure this skill keeps hitting to keep up the effect, and you can cast it every 12 seconds to keep the Spectral Cloak buff, providing that's the case. Hurricane is probably the one ability that you'd recognise a Stamina Sorcerer with. It's worth keeping this skill up more or less the whole fight, and gives you nice resistances, movement speed, and does pretty good damage that increases over time as well. Can't really ask for more. And finally, as mentioned earlier, we have the Greater Storm Atronach, incredibly strong single target DPS that lasts 28 seconds and provides a nice synergy to allies as well. Hopefully your teammates that wear Kinras will allow others to take it, because that major berserk shouldn't stack. Great, so onto the Parse. This rotation is really quite simple. Once you get into the groove, I'll mention now that I've left a digestible static rotation in the description below, if that helps at all. Essentially here you have the above 50% phase and the below 50% phase. Above 50% you keep up the Decloak, Soul Trap, Hurricane, Bub Trap and cast Bound Armaments when the 4 daggers are ready. Below 50% you drop Soul Trap and you drop Bound Armaments. The rest of the time you simply use Shrouded Daggers. Easy. In cases where you cannot use the Fatal Shrine daggers, then you could try the Master's Dual Wield instead, which will also provide pretty decent results. In that case, do ensure to slot Rending Slashes on your front bar, and you may also have to drop the Flying Pet for another spammable, such as Rapid Strikes or Crystal Weapon 2. Alternatively, you could try Setup 2, which is coming up next. Anyway, I don't really have too much more to say here, so I'll meet you guys at the end of this pass in a few minutes. Enjoy! Okay, cool. So first off, a quick mention of our race and Mundus Stone. They are Dhamma and Thief, and I believe this will also be the case in the second pass as well. Just look at how much damage Shrouders Daggers are doing. 34k of our total DPS with a max hit of 98k in Execute. The 2 Summonable Pets as well did a grand total of 7k DPS, which is pretty good considering they contribute passive spoil and weapon damage too. The Thaumaturge as well did nearly 11k DPS in total, and remember in real fights, when someone activates the synergy, the Thaumaturge itself will also gain Major Berserk for a short period of time. Definitely the strongest single target ultimate out there in the game. There is also a decent amount of damage done by the burning status thanks to the fiery enchant on the back bar. This is something new that we've seen in the new update as well. Looking at the blue CP Slottables, the ones chosen here are Backstabber, fighting Finesse, Deadly Aim and Thaumaturge. In runs where you won't receive the full damage from Backstabber, consider one of the alternative Slottables instead. Alright, so moving on to setup 2, and this is the 2-hand dual wield setup. On our head and shoulders, we are using 2 separate one pieces of monster sets. Slimecraw is the best for critical chance and is therefore the best one piece in the game at the moment, since it gives a little more than the others actually. We also have Grundwolf for the same reasoning. Crit chance is generally considered to be the strongest stat, followed by weapon and spell damage, and then max stamina or magicka. This applies to all damage dealers, by the way. Next, we have Relequen on the body as before. And then we have Kinras on the front bar with a sharpened greatsword in use here. In race situations, if you have enough physical penetration, then go ahead with precise instead. On the back bar, we have the Black Rose perfected daggers again as before. So an alternative to the Black Rose daggers on the back bar, by the way, for both builds can be the Maelstrom bow, and you can replace Deadly Cloak with Endless Hail skill wise. Onto the skills, excuse the secret gossip in the corner there. Bound Armaments, as before, can be cast every 4 or 5 skills. This time you can keep it up until around 15 to 20% in Execute, rather than 50% like in the first pass. Most of the remaining skills are the same, so I'll only mention the 2 new 2-handed ones. Firstly, we have Executioner, and as you can tell by the name, it's indeed an Execute. Use this from 30% and below as your spammable. Wrecking Blow is our spammable above 30%. It's a channeled ability, so do be careful when using it. It also gives Empower, which is kind of nice too. One suitable alternative if you don't like channeled abilities, like myself, is the Sorcerer skill, Crystal Weapon. And yeah, basically everything else is the same, so I'll just kind of let it play through and then we can speak about the pass itself. As before, there is a dedicated section in the description that explains a simplified static rotation based on what you see here. One of the slightly annoying things about sorcerers is that you can barely see what the character is doing when Hurricane is up, and it's even less clear on magical sorcerers with Boundless Storm, so apologies for that in advance. The most difficult part of this rotation will be getting good timing and rhythm for Wrecking Blow. Otherwise, the other portions of this rotation should be pretty straightforward should you have the fundamentals down. Anyway, I'll leave you again to enjoy the pass, and I'll catch up with you shortly. Okay, cool. So onto the CMX, pretty similar to the first pass in many ways. One thing to note is that the two-handed passives are generally not as strong as the dual-wield ones, or maybe it's the lack of weapons that give crit chance. I want to buy a massive two-handed dagger, please. The axe bleed was one of the attractions before, but with how axes have changed, that is no longer the case. Wrecking Blow though, Executioner and Bound Armaments are all dealing very high damages per cast, and much more even spread here compared to the previous one where Shred Daggers was doing over 30% of the total damage. At least it's not quite the Stamplar Jabs level yet. These Slottables are the same as before, so I shall let them play through for your convenience. Anyway, I hope this whirlwind tour of the Stamina Sorcerer has helped you out. You know what to do if you haven't already. Thanks to Zorax for his contribution in this. Thank you for taking your time to watch this video, and in case you haven't seen it yet, in the description there is a list of currently available Flames of Ambition builds which are displayed and updated all the time, and yeah, I'm going to have you covered for every class there is this patch, so stay tuned. Anyway, this is Liko, thanks again for watching, stay safe and have a nice day.